Oh yes, Calumet City, Illinois, known for its smiley face water towers more than anything else these days. It wasn't always known for its smiley face water towers, however. It used to be called Sin City. We'll get into all of that in this video.
There are actually two smiley face water towers in Cal City. There's Mr. Smiley, the one that we're looking at right now, by the River Oaks Mall, and then there's Mrs. Smiley on the opposite side of town. The Mr. Smiley water tower was the first to get painted.
Sexist.
And it was actually the idea of a kid back in 1972. Kim Fernero, who was 8 years old at the time, proposed to the mayor that the water tower would look a lot better with a smiley face on it. Well, the following year, the city council approved the notion and the smiley faces were painted on both water towers. Originally, both water towers were painted yellow, with the one by the mall having the bow and the one on the opposite side of town not having a bow, hence the Mr. and Mrs. In 2013, however, Mrs. Smiley was painted pink to support breast cancer awareness. Mr. Smiley sits behind the River Oaks Mall, which is a place that could use some smiling positive energy. The mall has been a survivor despite its struggles. Originally opened in 1966 as an outdoor mall, the River Oaks Mall has always been the largest in the south suburbs of Chicago. For a long time, it served as the main shopping mall for the larger Calumet region. In 1994, a redevelopment plan made River Oaks an indoor mall, but soon after that, the mall started its long and slow decline. The mall still has 64 stores, but the problem is that's less than half of the original store count. Calumet City recently has purchased the dead portion of the mall where a Sears and a Carson's used to be, and there's been a couple of proposals, one being a casino of all things and the other being a water park. The casino idea was rejected, but the water park was approved in 2022, but it's 2024 and no construction has started, so it's a waiting game to see if anything gets developed here soon. Well, the shopping mall isn't the only dead part of town, as downtown appears to be pretty dead too. There's not much of a reason for people to want to come here from the surrounding area because there's nothing here but some old, crumbling buildings, and if you were to visit Calumet City for the first time and the part of town that you saw was the downtown area, you would think that Cal City was just another south suburb of Chicago that has seen a large decline of its peak population. But that isn't really the case because at this point, Calumet City hasn't really lost that many people, especially when you compare it to some other communities in this region. It shouldn't be a surprise though if you see it dip below 30,000 within the next couple of census counts because despite the rich history of Calumet City, there's not much of a reason for people to want to live here today.
Racist.
No, it's not because of that. People of all ethnicities have been fleeing the south suburbs of Chicago, Calumet City included. It's mostly because of the sluggish economy, which is true for all of the Calumet region. It's why Gary has declined, Hammond has declined, Chicago Heights has declined, the south side of Chicago has declined, Harvey has declined, Riverdale has declined, and East Chicago, Indiana has declined as well. The steel and gas industries that once provided the gigantic Calumet region with thousands upon thousands of jobs only provide now a fraction of what they used to. That has had a huge impact on what this region has developed into throughout the 80s, 90s, and the new millennium. The only thing drawing people into Calumet City anymore over the last 40 years would be its affordability, but The problem is that families still have to be able to provide for themselves through jobs, and neither Cal City or the surrounding areas have many of those anymore, unfortunately so. I also have to point out another thing that works against Calumet City's future, and that would be the state that it's in, Illinois. Indiana is right next door too. The reason why that's a thing is because the taxes in Illinois are so much higher than they are in Indiana, and the people of this area know this. For example, Valparaiso is a city in Indiana that's about 25 miles southeast of Calumet City. The average property tax on a $194,000 home in Illinois is $4,476, while in Valparaiso, Indiana, it's $1,679, a savings of about $3,000. Thanks to SteinerHomesLTD.com for doing that math for me.
So Calumet City used to be called Sin City due to the gambling and the drinking that went on here during the Prohibition era. Couldn't help but notice this building here in the downtown area of Calumet City. Plays nicely to the city's heritage, that's for sure.
Despite the neighboring Lake County, Indiana being home to the declining cities of Gary and Hammond, the county as a whole has continued to grow in population very slightly, but it's growth nonetheless, whereas the Illinois side of the Chicago metro area has been shrinking pretty drastically. Today, 34,700 people are thought to be living in Calumet City, which is about 4% less than what was counted during the census in 2020. The median household income is substantially lower than the national and the state average. 20% of adults 25 and older hold a bachelor's degree or higher, and the median value of owner-occupied housing units is $125,000, while the poverty rate is 21%. Now, those numbers look pretty bad, but those numbers are actually pretty good when you measure them up to other South Chicago suburbs. On to the crime rates now, and honestly, they're not that bad. 430 for the violent crime and 2,500 for the property crime. There's plenty of other worse places in that regard, like, Gary, Chicago Heights, Harvey, yeah. Crime isn't that big of an issue in Cal City, especially when compared to the other nearby areas, and that's good to see. Now with that out of the way, let's start talking about some of the history for Calumet City. Cal City, despite the blue-collar look and feel, has always been considered as a bedroom community. There were some factories in town, but industry wasn't necessarily concentrated in Cal City. Most of the people who lived here would work in one of the surrounding communities, such as the south side of Chicago, Hammond, Gary, or Harvey. Hammond more so than any of the others. This aerial photo from 1938 shows just how much more developed Hammond was across the state line in comparison to Calumet City. The municipality was first founded in 1893 as the village of West Hammond, due to the fact that many of the people who lived here were working in the industries located in Hammond. Originally, German Lutherans made up the majority of the population in the village of West Hammond. In fact, the first church in the village of West Hammond was a Lutheran church. The place was largely agricultural too. It was a draw because it was far enough away from the crowded city of Chicago, but it was close enough to Chicago and to Lake Michigan for it to benefit economically from the port. By 1920, the amount of Irish, Italians, and Polish surpassed the amount of Germans in West Hammond, as the population of the municipality grew to be 7,500. 1920 was also around the time that West Hammond was starting to be known as Sin City, so let's talk about how the name of Sin City was given to West Hammond. It all started with booze. Indiana banned alcohol in 1918, which was 2 years before the national prohibition, so between 1918 and 1920, alcohol sales were legal in Illinois, but not in Indiana. And during this short period of time, West Hammond became popular among those who lived in northwest Indiana, which naturally made West Hammond the go-to spot for a lot of people to go buy liquor. Additionally, Al Capone and the Chicago outfit profited by providing businesses in West Hammond with alcohol. And of course, they continued to do so during the national prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933. So because alcohol became illegal everywhere in the country, organized crime was forced to take over the liquor scene in West Hammond. I mean, there was clearly a demand for such activities, and no law was going to stop people from partaking in drinking and gambling as long as it continued to be provided. So West Hammond was given the nickname of Sin City. It wasn't all over the town that this was happening. It was really just a small part of town. It all took place in a district that was called the Sin City Strip, or the State Street Strip.
This is where the State Street Strip was. Back in the day, there was a whole lot of gambling, prostitution, drinking during the Prohibition era. Right here on this stretch of State Street, it was a very small 2-block area. But today, there's a whole lot of nothing. A whole lot of nothing. It's all been cleared out. Just a couple of grass lots, some homes, and some old, shanky-looking buildings. Nothing really showing that this used to be the State Street Strip that gave Calumet City the name of Sin City.
The State Street Strip was located just west of the state line. This district was once full of blind pigs, gambling establishments, and prostitution. Here's a photo from who knows when, and here's another one from 1995. While it was a very popular place for adult entertainment and other forms of what was then illegal activity, some of which is still illegal today, not all of the residents of West Hammond were okay with this kind of stuff going on in their town. In 1923, the residents voted for a name change to Calumet City, as the thinking of the residents at the time was that if they changed their town's name, then the reputation of the place would change. But, of course, that didn't change anything, as the activity continued to happen along the State Street Strip. In fact, people from around the Midwest started to learn about what was going on in Calumet City, and it started to be the place to go to for much of the Midwest for Las Vegas-like entertainment. During this time, the city was also rapidly growing in population. The Strip was a polarizing part of town, no doubt, as many mayors and residents did all that they could to try and bring down the Strip, but the Strip was so popular that it was able to stay up. Jumping forward now from the 1920s and 30s all the way to the 80s and 90s, as by the 1980s, black and Mexican families started to move to Calumet City, and white families started to move away. The population of the town didn't decline necessarily, but it was more like a shifting of the demographics. The higher income group was replaced by a lower income group, and among this cultural shift was the addition of street gangs to Calumet City. In return, violent crime started to rise. A lot of it occurred within the Strip, and around the late 80s, the Strip started to take a turn for the worse. Prostitutes were infected with HIV from contaminated heroin needles. Bars that people would once hang out at started to become violent places to be. Some of the apartment complexes started to represent Section 8 public housing, so much so that the Department of Housing and Urban Development purchased a few of the apartments. Things changed here so much that in the early 90s, Calumet City was known as being one of the more dangerous suburbs in all of Chicago. The Sin City reputation was alive and well throughout the 80s, with as many as 166 businesses having a liquor license for a city that had just around 40,000 people. Prostitution was heavily present along not just the State Street Strip, but also along the stretch of State Line Road that we're driving down right now. The gang activity was centered around this area too. By 1992, there were a dozen or so street gangs who had a presence in Calumet City, and the Strip was no longer what it used to be many years ago. Well, in 1993, Calumet City had enough, and they started to fight against both the public housing and the State Street Strip. Police were aggressively cracking down on the illegal prostitution and gang violence that was occurring throughout the heart of Calumet City. By 1997, the city was able to clear out all of the buildings that remained from the old Strip, which is why that 2-block area is completely vacant today. The efforts to end the gang violence in Cal City proved to work out pretty well too, as today the crime rates are nowhere near what the town saw during that brief era from the late 80s to the late 90s. Those efforts in the mid-90s saved Calumet City from looking like another Harvey or Chicago Heights. All of the activity during the peak crime years for Calumet City during the 80s and 90s can explain the amount of vacant lots that we see in this part of town today. It might also explain why there's more than a few makeshift blockades along some of these streets, which were clearly once connecting streets as a part of the larger original grid street pattern of Calumet City. And that's just one of the handful of dead-end streets in this area that shouldn't really be a dead-end street. Speaking of dead-end streets, head south along State Line Road and you'll see dozens of them. From River Oaks Drive to the south border of Calumet City, there isn't a single crossing over the state line for cars. State Line Road becomes a boulevard, so to speak, just south of the intersection with River Oaks Drive. Only there's no way for traffic on the Illinois side to head north, and there's no way for traffic on the Indiana side to head south along State Line Road. You can also see from the air that along the southern portion of this weird stretch of State Line Road that there's a wall along State Line Road. The reason for this is because back in 2008, there was a devastating flood along the Little Calumet River. Other rivers flooded too, and overall, Northwest Indiana saw over $1 billion in damages due to extremely heavy rains. So the concrete wall that rises 4 feet above the ground is actually a flood wall that was first built in 2013. It was partially funded by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and it stretches for about a half mile. Much of the area that Calumet City, Hammond, and Gary were originally built on was low-lying wetland areas, so the land that's close to the Little Calumet River is all a part of a large floodplain. There's more to the story of the State Line Road boundary between Calumet City and Hammond, as in 2006, Hammond removed all of the street crossings in the median. Hammond also added an 8-inch curb on the other side of the boulevard. The curb stretches from the end of the flood wall north to the end of the grass median within State Line Road before the street reaches River Oaks Drive. Calumet City tried to sue Hammond for removing all of the crossings along with constructing the 8-inch curb, saying that it was racially motivated as Calumet City is predominantly black, and at the time, Hammond was mostly white. However, Calumet City was not able to win in court, and Hammond was justifying the decision by saying that it relieved traffic on the neighborhood streets. Hammond has a similar wall that blocks a street that once headed into Gary. That wall was constructed in 1981, and Hammond said that the wall was built to keep floodwaters out. Funny today how Hammond has started to see many of the same problems that Gary has seen. Stats even say that Calumet City has a lower crime rate than Hammond does too, so yeah, funny how things work out, eh? Speaking of flooding, apparently Calumet City has their own responsibilities to own up to. Flooding has been a major issue in this suburb over the past few decades, and in September of 2023, a flood devastated a trailer park in the far northwest part of town. Other parts of town flooded as well. But some of that is due to the infrastructure in Calumet City being outdated. There was a report a year prior in September of 2022 that provided a list of stormwater facilities and pump stations that were classified as being in poor condition, with even one of the pumps being considered to be no longer operational. Well, once the major floods happened in the fall of 23, it appeared as if there were no efforts by the city within that year's time frame to improve their failing flood control facilities. When the city's mayor and aldermen were asked about it by reporters, nobody responded with any requests. The city continued to be asked questions about the infrastructure through press conferences and other media appearances. Mayor Thaddeus Jones claimed that the pumps were working perfectly and no city with a dense urban layout would ever be able to handle 7 to 9 inches of rain that fell within a couple of hours. Now that might be correct to an extent, but what's also correct is that the storm system for Calumet City really needs to be upgraded badly, according to these engineers. It's not a good look when the public knows this and at the same time they see their leaders trying to dodge questions on the subject. What's also not a good look is that a report from February of 2024 states that Jones's wife and son make over $120,000 combined by working on behalf of the city. Despite the repetitive statements of Mayor Thaddeus Jones and Sabrina Jones did not respond to requests, it honestly doesn't look like it's so bad of an offense when skimming the article at first glance. Maybe that's because I'm still wrapped up in the Tiffany Henyard nonsense. Well, the first half of the article talks about how his wife made around $92,000 in 2023 as a part of the Violence Prevention Services program for Calumet City. Sabrina supposedly was not hired by her husband, rather, she was hired by Calumet City leadership, according to a statement from Andre Thomas, who was a program contact. But the first real eyebrow raiser in the Chicago Tribune article is quite a ways down when it mentions that the mayor's son, who works for Calumet City's public access TV station, made $38,000 over the course of 2023. Now that's not a huge number, but there was a written statement from the city's spokesman, Sean Howard, and it stated that Jones's son had worked for the TV station daily. A further look into public records, however, showed otherwise, as Jones Jr. worked only for half of the year and was paid for work for a stretch from May to November when he didn't work at all, and he made $32,000 during that time. Not sure what you know about public access TV, but let me tell you, yeah, there's not much money in that trade. Even worse is that Jones Jr. was hired as quote-unquote summer help, and at a public TV station, summer help means part-time, and part-time means minimum wage. So, yeah, $38,000, that's a little bit more than minimum wage. It's not much in today's economy, but it's more than minimum wage. So take that as you will. We've all seen worse offenders. Go ask Dalton, and go ask the rural Illinois town of Dixon how they feel about public corruption. This example in Calumet City is nothing compared to what we've seen in those communities, but at the same time, I'm sure it doesn't feel good to be a Calumet City resident knowing that the city hasn't done anything to take care of its outdated flood control facilities, despite the fact that they clearly know that something's wrong and they're not admitting it. It also can't feel good knowing that the mayor is trying to be slick by funneling some of Calumet City's public funds into the Jones Family Trust as quietly as he possibly can. Lastly, I can't move on without saying how Calumet City tried to sue a Daily Southtown newspaper reporter for seeking comments on the whole flooding infrastructure issue, and a week prior to me uploading this video to YouTube, Calumet City dropped the charges against the reporter after the story went national, so what's that tell you? Well, since I'm personally not seeking comment from anyone who works for the city, I think I'm safe. Yeah, you don't scare me, people working for Calumet City. Well, what's funny about the whole thing is that these offenses don't even seem to be all that bad, more like just a few slaps on the wrist. But the damage control department for the city seems to not be doing that good of a job. Maybe they should look into hiring a talented PR agent to fix their public image. Just take some of that money away from Jones Jr., who doesn't work for half of the year, and I'm sure the city could find a way to gather up the rest of the funds to be able to afford a better spokesperson. But yeah, seems like that would be in Mayor Jones' best interest. Well, lastly, this is Thornton Fractional North High School, home of the Meteors. Now that's a mascot I've never seen before. Creative, unique. I like it. Among the most notable alumni are some football players from generations ago, a few baseball players, an ex-NBA player, and a few politicians. None of them are fully recognizable names. Otherwise, hip-hop and R&B singer Tink is from Calumet City. Well, people, it is now that time. What did we learn in this video? We learned that in Calumet City you can't always trust that the sewer lines will do the job, just like how you can't always trust that local politicians aren't a part of a mob. But you can always trust Chris's livability score. The first category is education. Thornton Fractional North High School ranks well below average in math, reading, and science. U.S. News ranks it below almost every other high school in the south suburbs of Chicago, which says a lot. It gets a 4 out of 20. Crime is next, and it's not an out-of-control problem here, but it could be better. It gets a 10 out of 20. Next up is downtown, and downtown Calumet City is as underwhelming as it gets. There's clearly some space for a nice downtown. You have a park there and a few city government buildings, but otherwise, there's almost no restaurants and stores to check out. It gets a 2 out of 20. The fourth category is the economy, which is absolutely miserable. The only thing that Calumet City has going for it is that downtown Chicago is 20 miles north. The economy gets a 4 out of 20. Recreational opportunities is next. And with Calumet City being in an urban setting and with industries polluting the parts of the Lake Michigan shoreline that are closest to Calumet City, there isn't much outdoor recreation to be had outside of a few nearby Cook County forest preserves. Otherwise, you'll have to drive for dozens upon dozens of miles to get anywhere relevant. It gets a 4 out of 20. The history of Calumet City might be the place's saving grace on the also-serious Chris livability score. It's rather fascinating that the place was once a hub for adult entertainment. That, along with the blue-collar roots, makes Calumet City an interesting place. It gets a 13 out of 20. On to the next category, and you can find some amenities in Calumet City, but not near as many as you could find maybe 30 years ago. The mall is just about dead, the shopping around the mall is following suit. And outside of a bunch of cheap retail chains, it's hard to find anything nearby that's at the next tier. Amenities gets an 8 out of 20. Last up is cost of living, and the homes in Calumet City are incredibly affordable. Anyone who is looking to move into this town shouldn't have too much of an issue finding something within their budget range. It gets a 19 out of 20. All in all, the Chris livability score for Calumet City, Illinois is 64 out of 160, putting it towards the bottom out of all of the cities that I've done this for so far. Well, hey, if you want to see more of what Calumet City looks like, I drove around this place for quite a while, and down below is a second video on Calumet City where you can see all of the footage that I filmed but didn't use in this video. Otherwise, there's another city that I've been to that was once thought of as the Las Vegas of the Midwest. This place earned the nickname of Sin City 2, and you can watch a video that I made on this place that I'm speaking of right here. Peace.